Angela Farr-Schiller, and I'm the Director of Arts Education at the Arts Bridge Foundation at the Cobb Energy Performing Arts Center in Atlanta, Georgia. I have the very, very good fortune to be your moderator for this conversation. I would like to start off by saying a really huge thank you to the Lowry Institute, to Kenneth Green and his ridiculously amazing team for bringing us here tonight. I am here also in conversation with two fabulous women on our panel, Anne Collins Smith, joining us from New Orleans, and Dr. Tara Pixley, joining us from Los Angeles. Before we start with our panelists giving us a kind of brief introduction of themselves, I'd like to say to everyone at home, if at any point during the conversation you have any questions or thoughts or ideas or things that you'd like to put into the pot, go ahead and go into our chat and you can go ahead and put a question in and we'll get to as many of them as we're able to. So starting with Anne, could each of you give us a brief introduction of yourself and your relationship to the visual arts?
Anne Collins Smith. I am curator of collections at the Spelman College Museum of Fine Art. You know, my field is visual arts, but I love all of the arts and I bring all of them to performing, music, dance, theater, literature into my curatorial practice. But my day job is being the curator of the Spelman College Museum of Fine Art, their curator of collections.
Thank you so much. Dr. Pixley?
Hi, thank you, Angela, and thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here with all of you. My name is Tara Pixley. I am a professor of journalism at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, and I have a 20-year career in journalism as a photographer, photo editor, a writer, and also a copy editor, a short period of time, but it happened. And I, similar to Anne, have a robust love for many forms of art. I actually started out in dance at a very young age and continued that through into adulthood. And I took up photography in high school and became a professional photojournalist, in part because of my mutual love for visual art and for kind of understanding the social realm and the political realm of our world. So I primarily work in documentary photography and also documentary film, but I deeply enjoy and care about and am familiar with many forms of art, and will be speaking primarily to photography this evening.
Absolutely. As I said, an embarrassment of riches as far as our panelists go. So I'd like to start us off tonight with a quote by Dr. Angela Davis, which states, "I am no longer accepting the things that I cannot change. I am changing the things that I cannot accept." This quote really resonated with me in thinking about our conversation for this evening. And I really think it's a fruitful and generative place to start the conversation, because many of the artists and the pieces that we're going to be talking about tonight are using their art and using their art practices to do just that. Using the visual arts to change the things they cannot or will not accept. So with that, let's kind of start our conversation off kind of on the ground floor so that everybody here on the panel and everybody at home is kind of starting off on the same page. The term visual arts covers a really, really wide range of artists and art making practices. How would each of you define the visual arts for the average person?
I would say it's a painting of a lovely picture, or maybe not so lovely, something that engages you and intrigues you. It addresses an issue visually. It can be painting, it could be poetry. Poetry, of course. Painting, photography was the word I was looking for. It could be sculpture, it could be a collage, it could be performance art. So in arts, there's video art and there's performance art, which all kind of takes place in many venues. So art is expression, it's visual expression, something that you can see. And it should ripple out to something you really feel, from the 2D to the 3D to the multidimensional aspect of impact.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that visual art is anything that any creative entity or project or object that that we are experiencing in some way, either real or imagined, through vision, through the way that we see, through the way that we understand the world visually. And I think that that can be expanded even far beyond what I'm stating here, because I always like to think about our relationship to vision as aligned with a particular understanding of ability or disability. So when I think about visual and vision, I am always trying to imagine a sort of additional realm in which sight itself as a sort of physical ability isn't necessarily the only way in which we can engage a sort of visual art. And that's very complicated. That would be a whole talk in and of itself. But my experience of visual art is really something that is playing with those ideas of what the visual is and having us sort of think more about it.
Absolutely, because I think the ability to quote unquote see does not just rest with the eyes. That being said, I will say that both of our panelists were super generous to gather different pieces for us to be able to engage with this evening. And as we talk about them, I would like to ask both of our panelists to be able to maybe describe what we're seeing in case we have people who are joining us who might have challenges around vision as well. So the first question, I think, Anne, well, actually, can we go to the first set of images? And I think, Anne, they come from you. But of course, Dr. Pixley, feel free to jump in at any point.
Okay, this work is by an artist named Vanessa L. German. The name of it is Delia on the Plain. And so what you see here is an assemblage is what it's called of, a discarded perhaps baby doll figure that the artist has treated, has she added to. So you see that this doll is wearing the American flag. Ironic that the American flag was brought up yesterday in conversations. And you see this head figure. The head is a cabbage slicer. And on the head is a transfer of the image of Delia. Delia, and there's another image of her close up, but also you see like in her core, and you see the red, white, and blue colors, but you also see these nails. And this object is a power figure that the artist has created, is inspired by the Congolese divination to the Nkisi Konde, which is the progenitor to the power. It's a power figure, but it's a progenitor to the voodoo doll. And you divine this figure by you're adding nails, these elements have certain powers. And so Delia, whose image we're looking at, was a figure whose photograph was taken against her will. She's, nude from the top up. Her image has been used in anthropology books. This is a woman whose agency was removed from her. And so in this work, Vanessa German gives her power back by, placing her image on this Nkisi Konde, I dare to say voodoo doll, this power figure.
Why do you say you dare to say voodoo doll?
Because when people think voodoo, they think of something salacious, and it's really not that salacious. So it's a power figure, it's a voodoo doll, So this is an image. This is one of the Nkisis. This work is at the Brooklyn Museum, and I saw it last summer on a visit there, and I was just astounded by it because I hadn't seen any Nkisi like it. And so this is a male Nkisi figure, but he's wearing this, these raffia feathers, and I just like, wow, and just those two things, from the ancestral to the now, and how we, rely on our own innate powers to, combat some of those social injustices and ills. And how the Vanessa German, using Delia, who had no agency, but giving her power back, even ancestrally or in hindsight, or as an artist, or as her, her, I won't say fictive kin, but as her descendant, changing the narrative of who Delia is.
Absolutely. Oh, can you speak to this image here?
So that's the original image of Delia. So what's happening now is that Delia's, there was a photo taken by Zealy, Joseph Zealy, by the anthropologist, I believe, Louis Agassiz, of Delia and her father, Renty. So Delia and Renty's ancestors are with us, and they are challenging Harvard about the use. So this image is in the Peabody Museum at Harvard. So they're challenging Harvard about the use, the perpetual use of the images of their ancestors. So this is what the images imposed or transferred onto the cabbage slicer. And we know the cabbage slicer is, a metaphor for a guillotine. And, it really references to what, some in this country do with Black people or attempt to do in their oppressions and worse. And so this is Delia, and I intentionally, blurred out her bosom.
Great, thank you so very much. I'd like to open this question up to both of you. And I think, Anne, you've already kicked the barn doors all the way open with the images that you've provided us for this first question. But could each of you speak to the specific kind of US legacy, right, or kind of imprint or history of visual art at this intersection of social justice? And I believe we also have some images that have been contributed for us to engage with for this as well.
So I'll start. One of the reasons that I've always connected with photography is because I think it's this interesting, and photojournalism in many ways specifically, it's this interesting intersection of showing us what our reality is and producing that reality. Because when we say that an image holds truth in it, like that what we're showing through this particular photograph is an accurate representation of what happened, what people look like, what they did, who they are, where they were, then that begins to produce in our minds the kind of framework of reality. However, every image is produced by an individual and selected by an editor or a curator, and then published with the framework of captions and other designed content, or in an online space. Wherever the image is, it is produced by these, with very many different components adhering to it and part of that production process. So the reason why I bring that up is that I think photography for me has always created a space in which it's possible to imagine a different world. And it's also important to recognize that we are in the process of creating a particular social imaginary with every image. And in documentary photography, the photo of Delia that Anne is showing us here in this artwork, it's part of this long history of how Black people and Blackness and enslavement was imagined in America. And the photograph has always been used as a power structure. Whoever held the camera and had the power to wield that over the Black and brown body was able to imagine what Blackness is and could be, what constrained it, and what bound Black bodies in particular ways. And it produced a relationship to colonization, to slavery, to freedom, to segregation, to desegregation. All of those ideas were playing out in many ways through images. So I feel that so much visual art gets to speak to those photos in this way, like the Delia image, and draw on those very problematic ways in which visuals were used to bound Blackness in this country and elsewhere, certainly. But that to me is kind of one of the important ways in which visual art is always at the intersection of what is and what is possible. It's always making and remaking itself.
Absolutely. And as we queue up to go to the next image, it's really nice to be able to see the first set of images, because we kind of see the image of Delia, and then we get a chance to see a visual artist clapping back, right? That Vanessa L. German is in direct response to that that boundageness, right, that happened with that photo. Thank you so much. All right, so let's go to this next image and kind of thinking about kind of the US legacy of visual art at this intersection of social justice?
So this is a photograph by Don Hogan Charles, who was a Black photographer in New York, who was known for, he was the first Black photographer published in the New York Times, and he was known for photographing the civil rights movement. And I think that I selected this image because I'd actually never heard of Don Hogan Charles throughout my lengthy education in photography and my lengthy career in photography. It was a name that had not come up that often, and there are very few Black photographers who have reached the level of esteem in photography that they were due. There are, I'm sure, hundreds of other photographers who were due a level of esteem they did not achieve in the larger photographic community due entirely to being Black. But I wanted to use this image because what I see Don Hogan Charles doing here is so resonant with the images that I'm seeing coming out of the contemporary Black Lives Matter movement, our own ongoing civil rights movement in this country, which is, you know, it was like we had a coda in which we paused for a second and then we came back to it as a country, realizing that the work was not done during the civil rights movement of last century. And so, but you'll see it, actually, can you go to the next image now, please?
Sure.
It's useful to, so this is an image by Devin Allen, another Black photographer, Baltimore photographer, who captured the response to Freddie Gray's death at the hands of police brutality. And seeing these two images in relationship to each other, this, you know, with, I think, 70 years apart, it's really powerful to notice how similar the sentiment and aesthetic is in capturing the relationship of the young Black boy to the power structure of the police, and how that relationship has actually not changed in really ever, right? But certainly not in that time since these two images were made. And so visual art has the capacity to stick a moment in time, right? And show us how little, how much or how little has changed in the space between these two visual imaginings of our social world.
Can I ask, actually, just to kind of follow up with this, especially thinking about the ways that these two images in very different time periods and even centuries, right, are holding hands with each other. Is there within this genre of what you notice a difference when the photographer is Black and when the photographer isn't?
Absolutely. I've actually been writing a lot about that recently. So this is, of course, a huge generalization. So I will say this with the caveat that there are, of course, some Black photographers, one whose image I will show in a minute, actually, who do capture quite a bit of the violence and, you know, sort of the more visceral things happening at protests. But I have found that predominantly Black photographers, and especially Black female and non-binary photographers, tend to focus their lens on the sort of experiences of Black people and Blackness, the senses of community in these protest spaces. I find that they are often, or we rather are often, focusing our lenses on how people have come together against tyranny, against oppression, rather than simply focusing on the more, again, visceral relationship to violence between the people, the protesters, and the police, which those things are, of course, incredibly important. Those things change policies, they change minds. And in the next two images, actually, if we could go to those, that would, or oh, no, we'll go back to mine later then. So just to finish out what I was saying about the protest imagery is that I have found there tends to be an emphasis on community and community care with Black photographies, with Black photographers and the Black aesthetic, over a kind of emphasis on violence.
Actually, if we're able to go back to the last image, I would love to hear how that's being created by the photographer as you read this image.
And so for me, this image and the one that came before, I love this this emphasis on the Black child, because it's always putting us in relationship to them as an adult, right? I have a 14-year-old son and a 10-year-old daughter. I can't hear any story about George Floyd or Ahmaud Arbery or Freddie Gray or Breonna. I can't hear any of those things without imagining my own child in that space and imagining all of the little Black children that I know and love that I'm watching grow up. And I think that's what these photos that emphasize the Black child and put them in the center of the frame, they're asking us to be that child's parent, to imagine ourselves as both parent and child, to imagine what kind of future do we want in this country for Black children, for Black humans, for Black bodies, and always putting that smallness, that vulnerability in a visual relationship to the structure and the sort of sense of violence coming that these police in their riot gear and their kind of facelessness, and then also experiencing that view from being behind the child, right? So it's like we're looking as he is looking, we're seeing what he is seeing rather than seeing him. So we're really embodying, I think, this moment in that relationship between vulnerability and a power structure that won't give way.
Absolutely. And I really appreciate your kind of nodding to this idea of also like time and Blackness, right? So because it is with the focal point of the child, we're looking at the current moment, and we're also thinking automatically, because it is a child, about the future, right? What will happen next, especially with the police officers having this impending force where they haven't quite met yet. It hasn't quite been determined what's going to be happening, but it really holds that kind of what's happening now and the potential for what's going to be happening in the future. I'm just really beautiful, scary image that you bring up. So let's actually go to, we got a little preview of it, the next image. And I think this image comes from you, Anne.
It does. And so it just perfectly segues from what Tara was sharing as, what photography does. It was because of a photograph that was in Jet magazine of Emmett Till and his casket by Moneta Sleet that influenced, that, made the civil rights movement and the need and the moment even more just immediate, and the time is now. And so I just want to say that our ancestors are with us, and I'm a little bit taken aback because this is the first time I've really seen David Driscoll's birth and death dates. And so this image is called Behold Thy Son, right? And this is an homage or compelled, I won't say inspired, by what happened to Emmett Till. And so, this positions the Black child as a Christ-like figure, and there's this trope or this theme in classical arts called the Pietà or the pity, where the Mother Mary is holding her dead child, Jesus. Mm-hmm. And so as mothers, as aunties, as cousins of, people who love Black men, the images are arresting, and just to see a live image of a child facing the policeman or running from the policeman just makes this image, created in 1956, I think Emmett Till was murdered in 55, all the more prescient and jarring. So that's what this image is. And it was because of a photograph that the world began to understand how serious the situation was in the United States.
Can you talk about the significance of its relationship to Christianity, especially Christianity in 1956?
So in the 50s, a lot of the movement was happening through and with the churches. That's where the people met. That's where they prayed. That's where they centered themselves. So I think there's a next image here that speaks to that, the importance of the moment. So the churches were not yet. I could talk about that later, actually.
Sure.
Yeah, I can talk about that later. But the churches were really the center of the movement.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I also, before we move on to the next kind of set of images, can you talk about David C. Driscoll? You said it kind of gave you a moment of pause to see those dates. Can you talk about the significance of their work?
So David Driscoll is, even in his ancestry, one of the preeminent African American art historians. There is, an award named for him at the High Museum called the David C. Driscoll Prize, in which an artist and an art historian are awarded a prize to continue their practice. He organized one of the first major shows of African American art and culture. It was 2 centuries of African American art for the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. And even then, and even as it is now, which I'll talk about later, the Black presence, inclusive of, being, depicted on the art in the wall, but the Black presence in museums as curators, as directors, as leaders, as docents, as visitors, and even the security is where you see most African Americans even now, but the Black presence was even contested then. And so he was one of those luminaries who made this field a little bit, who opened the doors for many of us curators and art historians. Worked at Fisk, worked at University of Maryland, where there's a David C. Driscoll Center, and at Talladega, an artist and an art historian. And we miss his presence, but we will proudly continue his work. And his work continues. And, Driscoll died April 1st, and, this work still resonates, unfortunately.
Unfortunately. I want to say that I really appreciate, as we get ready to move to the next kind of series of images, the ways that we're getting introduced for some to a lot of different visual artists in different mediums. So I think it's really wonderful to be able to have both the piece and then to be able to talk about the person who created the piece. So thank you so much. So, and we're already kind of doing this. So while we're already on this train, let's continue on this conversation about visual arts, social justice, and Black social justice movements in particular. So we have this first image up here. Dr. Pixley, would you mind kind of bringing this forward for us?
Yeah, of course. And now I'm really sensing that I should have had them put side by side so we could talk about them. So this is a photograph by Bill Hudson. He was a white photojournalist who primarily worked for the Associated Press and was well known for his coverage of the Southern Civil Rights Movement. And I found this image so interesting because I know it's really tiny, I apologize for that. It's depicting a police officer beating Black men, and it has this the tableau of the kind of the store being looted behind you, where you see the glass broken out, and it's like some kind of clothing store. And that just put me so in mind of the same kind of imagery, seeing that again repeated. So similar to what I was saying before with the image of the young Black boy in relationship to the police. Now we have the adults, protesters, and their relationship to the police. These young men are only a few years away from having been that little boy, and are now subject to the aggression and violence of the police, the brutal police state in America. And if you can go to the next image, please. So this is by Malik Sidibe, who's a very young, brilliant New York photographer. And he's actually an editorial portraitist, but he saw what was happening with the Black Lives Matter protests in May and June, and decided to come and photograph it. He felt like he had to be present. I had the great privilege of being on a panel with him recently talking about our work photographing the Black Lives Matter protests and the movement. And so I loved what he was saying about his images and his relationship to deciding to photograph violence. And I won't speak for him here, but what I see in the image is this continuation, right? Where, like I said before, there was kind of like this pause in which we didn't quite visualize or imagine this ongoing police brutality. We wanted to believe that it had perhaps, remained in the 60s and the 70s and that we had moved on from that. And now we see again that in relationship to the images that we saw before, there has been little to no change. If in fact there has been a change, it's that the police are now more heavily militarized than they were before, and more capable of bringing additional violence into communities, and finding ways. Bike cops are doing this, and then seeing the kind of the people, the bystander protesters watching the the kind of repetition of the glass in the building behind this violence that's going on. It also, to me, speaks to the way capitalism is always a part of this frame, right? It's always the structure within which we are struggling against the power of the police and our right as Black people to survive and exist and not to remain alive, So I love looking at these, well, I don't love, but I think it is useful to look at these images in relationship to one another and think about what this says about social justice. Where are we in terms of achieving or not achieving social justice, and how can the visual render that very apparent for us in our contemporary social moment?
Absolutely. I think we can go on to the next image. Yes. Anne, would you like to lead us off talking about this image?
Sure. So this work is by, I'm using a lot of superlatives because these individuals were superlative, by the preeminent African-American artist, Jacob Lawrence, who is known for his series such as the Harriet Tubman series, the Underground Railroad series, of course, featured Harriet Tubman, and the Great Migration, and the Toussaint Louverture series. The name of this work is called The Praying Ministers. This work is in the permanent collection of the Spelman College Museum of Fine Art, but it's currently on long-term loan at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Praying Ministers. Of course, the ministers are praying. It's interdenominational, interfaith group of ministers praying in the midst of protests, right? Civil rights protest. You see an armed guard to the left and to the right. And one of the things that I noticed from the two photos back about how one of those officers in the photograph of the Freddie Gray riots, the little boy with the two police officers, I think one of those police officers.
More back from that,
I think.
That one.
Yeah, right.
Back this way one more time. There we go.
The police officer on the left looked African American. And one of the things I always doing, like compare and analysis, and we can go back to our painting, the painting again. One of these police officers, one of the military officers appears to be Black. That's just something I noticed. You pick up details as you look at it, keep looking at it. So here are ministers in the midst of prayer, kneeling, and we know how kneeling has been politicized, right? And so you were asking what was the role of the church, particularly the Black church, or many churches during our movements. And I ask that question now: what is the role of the church here? It's to speak truth to power and to, center us as we still struggle. The church where I attend, Reverend Andrew Young has become the pastor of global ministry, and we're happy to have him. And he's still, in the fight, and he was in this fight then. So the church is very important now and then. And so this piece's name is Praying Ministers, and it's taken from the burial at Arnon. But here's something that's interesting about this work. Jacob Lawrence was, from New Jersey. He retired in the Pacific Northwest. So he knew nothing about the civil rights movement. And what he saw from the movement was the television. And so he painted, right? And so he was also a part of this group called Spiral. And Spiral was founded by Romare Bearden. and the other, once Atlanta-based artist, Hale Woodruff, to address the civil rights movement. So the artists made works, in response to the civil rights movement, and used many of the proceeds to fund the movement, to help people going. So arts is a ways of expression and a way of, generating resources to continue, what we do, to continue our work, be it on the canvas, be it on the streets, on the ground, but it's all advocacy.
Absolutely. Well, picking up this idea of our work, I just got the notice that we're at the 10-minute mark, which I can't believe it. I can, but I can't. So I would love if we could actually move on to the images that we were going to talk about for question number 5. In thinking about this idea of our own work, can you talk about your own practices in relationship to this intersection of social justice and visual art?
So let's go to the artists.
Yes, absolutely. Dr. Would you like to start us off?
Oh, I just saw you had Zanel Mohole's work, and I love their work. Actually,
a lot of people doing great work out there. That's so what the takeaway is for sure. Okay, well, let's start with this image first.
Okay. So as I mentioned, I'm a photojournalist, and I did go and photograph quite a few protests in Los Angeles. And I originally went out not to photograph the protests. I went out to cop watch because I was hearing from colleagues and friends who were attending protests in the very beginning that what they were seeing, what they were experiencing was radically different from what they were seeing portrayed on the news. And as a journalist, it's very important to me to hold both my journalist peers and colleagues accountable, and to demand a higher level of media literacy from my non-journalist colleagues. And so I'm often like towing this weird line there. So when I did go to protest, I ended up seeing so many beautiful moments of just like Black girl magic and Black collectivity and just community building. And so I did begin photographing the LA protests. And this is one image that I really liked a lot. There's something about it that when I saw this moment of this young man sitting in the trunk, and it actually reminded me so much of Atlanta, which I'm from Atlanta and I miss dearly. And it just felt powerful. It felt very true to the reality that I was experiencing of people speaking truth to power, and speaking back to that power that has been brutalizing us in our communities for a long time. And then I think it was one photo back, maybe there's an image of, I think back, and keep going back. There we go. This one. Thank you so much. Or one more. Thank you.
One more. There. Stop.
This one right here.
Oh, one more. We'll get it. Don't worry. There we go.
Awesome. So this is a protest that happened in Hollywood, and this was the day that the National Guard was there with live rounds, and that warning had been going out around the city to protesters that the National Guard were authorized to use force and had lethal rounds, not just the rubber bullets, which were doing their own serious violence. One photographer actually lost an eye from a rubber bullet. And this image, really, this moment resonated with me. This woman here and her daughter, this woman was actually leading the chant of the protest chant. She was walking back and forth the crosswalk. And what you can't see is that behind where I'm the positionality of the photographer, I'm surrounded by hundreds of people. And so we have this line of National Guard, a line of protesters who were holding up their signs, and then the Black female body, the image of the mother and her daughter, the Black woman to be in America, with all of these structures of power. You can also see that mostly, if not all of the people in the protesters in that line were white, because at a certain point, the protesters said, white people to the front, put your body on the line. And they did. And, there's so much context to this image that you can't quite get just from looking at it. But all of those different these lines arrayed in time, and thinking about what social justice means. How can we actually achieve it? What does that look like? and having these people sort of protecting in, you know, at least in this visual space, in this one frame, I think it can give this sense of them being the line of the protectorate between the state violence and surveillance and the young Black body and young Black woman who is speaking truth to power.
Absolutely, absolutely. Is there another image going this way, or the next one behind this image that we could go to? And I think this was one that you contributed in relationship to thinking about your own practice as a curator or as a contributor. Would you like to speak to this one?
Sure. This happens to be the work by an artist who I did my first exhibition about, but not this work. So this is an international artist, artist from South Africa. Her name is Bernie Searle. And this work, well, this work accompanies a video called Interlaced, in which she goes to the town hall in Bruges, Belgium to bear witness, right? She goes to this town hall, she's wearing this Black lace that was made in South Africa. You know, Belgium was once famous for their lace, but she used a specific lace to say, hey, Belgium, this is how you rape and pillaged our land, right? And so the name of this work is called Lament. And so this is a woman in mourning, right? And so it's about us who are left behind. Her hands are gold, and gold for a reason, right? She's gilded the hands because the Belgian soldiers had to account for the bullets that they use by cutting off an appendage of their I don't know, their victim. And so they had to bring that back. So there's still this practice in Belgium where they still sell these chocolate hands, and these chocolate hands are our hands, right? So as our role, I don't want to say I'm the mourner, but I bear witness to it all. And her stepping into their town hall, stepping into what I guess they would call their arena, you know, she's telling them, she's confronting them. So my role as a curator is, you know, curator means to take care of, you know, I'm an intermediary, right? I'm an intermediary for the artist. I'm an intermediary for what they create. I make sure that it's taken care of, that it's placed in the most honorable, and its context has integrity. I'm also, you know, an intermediator for the audience. It doesn't matter who the audience is, you know, but I will share with you, if my father doesn't understand my work, then I have failed. So for those people who may not understand that, you know, there are some other works I can talk about how I work, but also setting context in which to understand, enjoy, and see them, you know, whoever see themselves in works of art, right? To make the place a contested place, sometimes the museum a more comfortable and engaging and welcoming experience. You know, helping to emphasize setting up a framework. So that's what I try to do in my work, and I instigate.
And you instigate, absolutely, absolutely. That's the heart of all artistry, right?
Yeah.
So as we get to our last few questions, I wanted to talk about, I think sometimes when people think about visual art, they might go to the tropes of like in the museum or something that feels separate from the everyday, potentially. Can you talk about the ways that visual art is interspersed in our lives every day, in our cityscapes, in our newspapers, in ways that might surprise people that they're taking in visual art, but they might not call it visual art, or they might not see it as that as they pass by that mural of John Lewis, you know, to get their coffee in the morning? And this question can be for both Tara or for Anne.
You know, I deeply love murals, and it's something that both Los Angeles and Atlanta have some really beautiful installation art and street art, and, you know, very intentional interventions into the environment and the space, things that make us think, things that allow us to heal and mourn as a community. There's a lot of imagery around Kobe Bryant here in LA and around Nipsey Hussle. And those things to me are so powerful, because not everyone can make it to a museum or a gallery, and not everyone, even if they can afford to be in those spaces, can connect to art in those spaces. Like Anne was saying, you know, I feel similarly. If the work I'm doing isn't accessible to everyone, or at least to most people, then I have failed in whether I'm working as a photographer, a curator, or a writer around these issues. And so I find that street art is so important. And I have one image that kind of speaks to this. There's this beautiful
Sure.
piece called 54 Columns in Old Fourth Ward in Atlanta. And I photographed this young dancer leaping among those columns. And for me, it was, you know, something I try and achieve in my imagery is to emphasize Black joy. I mentioned several times Black community, but to me, Black joy is actually the most important thing that we can depict, because we've seen Black victimhood, we've seen Black enslavement and Black misery and Black violence and all of the ways in which we are asked to imagine Blackness as intrepid and oppressed in this country and elsewhere. What we need to see is Black normalcy, Black family, Black childhood, Black joy, Black eating, Black worshiping, right? And all of the wonderful moments of our lives lived out visually, so that we can reimagine what is possible for Blackness, for Black Americanness, for Black children, for all Black people. And I think that visual art installed in the environment is a component of that. It especially when it's brought into primarily Black and brown neighborhoods. So it makes us see our environment as beautiful, and we are part of that environment. It's all about reimagining what is possible and engaging. You're reaching yourself and others on a subconscious level. And I think that is what we need to be moving towards. So the photo I was speaking to is far down the line. I don't want to take up too much time with looking for it, though.
That's fine. I think it's fine also just to kind of stroll through as you're speaking is fine, or as you're thinking through this question.
Yeah.
About the ways that visual art surrounds us, uplifts us, and this focus on accessibility and joy, right, in this field of visual art. So I will ask, actually, since this will be my unfortunately last question, can you each give us a brief shout out, or give a shout out to the people who are watching and with us today, how they can continue to engage with your work? As curator, as artist, as professor, how might they continue to be able to engage with the ways that you are interrogating, lifting up the world and our humanity?
I'm enjoying looking at these images. You know, follow the Spelman College Museum of Fine Art and on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter to see all of the things that we're doing. And we have an announcement coming soon. You know, keep looking at beautiful work, please. There's a question that I would love for us to answer. Know that, you know, our lives are about beauty too, as opposed, even in the face of trauma. Keep reading, keep finding something beautiful to look at every day. Love on each other. You know, so this is what I do in my practice. It's about really a love practice. You know, it's about uplifting. And look at these beautiful images. Oh, will you tell us about those images and tell us how you come to that, Tara? So, you know, I'm scoping Tara's work too. So, so I have to support her.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And so then, Dr. Pixley, how can people in the audience get to know your work or engage with your work a little bit more? Where can they go to get more of this sustenance?
Well, I would be honored if you wanted to follow me on Instagram. I'm at TLPix, so TLPIX. And I am a co-founder and currently on the board of Authority Collective, which is an organization focused on women and non-binary photographers of color. So I would love it if you would check out Authority Collective, follow us on Instagram and Twitter, check out the website. We showcase the work of Black and brown and women and non-binary photographers around the world. So it's a really lovely space on Instagram that is a very diverse array of imagery. And I would encourage, this image is something I did for ESPN magazine where, oh gosh, I forget his name, but there's a NFL football player. He and his brother go to Comic-Con every year and they dress up as anime characters. And I've always loved this image because you never see Black people in costume. You don't see Black people doing fun things like just pretending to be animated characters. And that is what I want us to see more of. That is what I want us to seek out. Wherever you see people emphasizing what Black people don't do and can't have, and the oppression that we have visited upon us, refresh your palette. Look for these moments of Black joy and beauty. Look for the woman throwing her head back and laughing joyously. Look for men holding each other and loving each other and stepping outside of these toxic masculinity, toxic patriarchal ideas. Look for Black people amongst flowers and sky. That's what I value. That's what I try and depict. And I join a long line and very, very many contemporary artists who are trying to do that work of reimagining Blackness in the visual sphere.
Absolutely. I have to say, I think it's pretty appropriate that we went over time because you truly cannot put a container on Black joy. You just can't do it. So with that, I will say I am beyond humbled to be in your presence, both for those who joined us in your individual spaces at home, for our panelists. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Ann Collins, Dr. Pixley, thank you for the generosity of your time, your wisdom, and your brilliance. And with that, I will turn it back over to the Lowry Institute and Kenneth Green. All right, Kenneth, I'm calling you. I'm serious. I'm calling you, Kenneth. All right. Well, then maybe I'm going to take us up for this evening. Thank you, everybody, for joining us here in my home. But on behalf of the Lowry Institute, thank you to our panelists. Thank you for all who joined us. Please stay tuned. Next week, Thursday, 6 to 7 p.m. will be the last and final installment of the Lowry Institute's series of artists in conversation. And I believe it will be around musical theater. So I hope that you will join us back again next week, and definitely reach out to our panelists, see what they're doing, because obviously this work cannot be contained. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Angela. Thank you, Ann.
All right, take care.
Bye.
More soon,
Have a good
everyone.
night.
All right.
Hello? Hello? Hey, Kenneth.
Oh my God.
Sorry, I didn't mean to step over you. When you didn't come back, I was like, I'll just take us out.
No, I was waiting to come back. They didn't bring me back.
Oh.
So I think they're just gonna end it right now. But I was waiting. I didn't agree that. Kendra, you were amazing.
This was so great.